Most players think they know how to c-bet until they torch money in a spot that should be totally automatic. My client Alan won $5,500 in a single session installing these two frameworks, which I'll share with you in a minute. If you're a busy working professional, you run your own business, you're retired, or someone that plays poker part-time, this is for you. My name's Alec Torelli. I'm the founder of Conscious Poker, and I've been playing poker professionally for 20 years, and I've coached hundreds of clients just like you. Give me 10 minutes, and I'll show you exactly what Alan changed and how you can use the same process to start winning with confidence. This is Conscious Poker. All right, here's the deal. Alan is a very solid player. He has good fundamentals, he relies heavily on his intuition, and he's break-even or winning in his local games. Relying on intuition is great, and it works extremely well. I would argue even better than theory, but it only works in certain spots. For example, if you are in a big pot on the river and you get a solid read, or you have history with an opponent, or you know their tendencies, you could make a big exploitative adjustment and gain a massive edge in that spot. Where the intuition falls short and where theory, fundamentals, and a sound, robust strategy is crucial are spots where you don't have those clear reads, or perhaps routine spots where you need to know what to do. You need to know a solid winning strategy based on the ranges, based on the math, based on the theory. And a key example of that, maybe one of the most important, is a continuation betting strategy. So you raise preflop, your opponent calls in the big blind, your head's up in position, probably one of the most common spots you're going to face over and over and over again. And the clincher here is this is a spot you're going to face hundreds of times, far more often, in fact, than that big spot on the river. So it's crucial that you have a very solid theoretical strategy because you don't have enough information yet, perhaps, to exploit your opponent. And this is where the foundation takes place and the key adjustments that I made with Alan. So the two problems that I saw when I reviewed his session was very common, and I see this amongst many of my clients. The first is misidentifying the board and the texture, and the second is not applying the right sizing. So let's walk through both and the adjustments that are crucial in this spot. Before we dive in, Alan, like I'm sure many of you, are quite busy, and you're not going to have time, or it's not even recommended, to go into the lab and run 1,000 sims to figure out all the different heuristics and nuances and specifics of every single different situation. After all, there are more ways to shuffle a deck of cards than there are grains of sand on Earth. So of course, you're never going to memorize every single blind output. What's much more important is to understand the simple frameworks or the simple takeaways that you could apply toward pretty much every situation that you're going to face, and how to generally think about strategy from a first principle standpoint. And that's the 80-20 or Pareto principle that I try to impart on my clients to help them develop solid frameworks, simple heuristics, and strategies that are effective, profitable, and that they could actually implement without getting lost in the theory and the charts. So here is the way I like to think about the first concept. I call this idea range leverage. Basically, I want you to think about when you were a kid or observing your kids or whatever, when you watch them play on a pendulum or a teeter-totter, as we call it if you're watching from America. And so basically, when you played on this teeter-totter when you were a kid, you'll probably notice a pattern that whoever is more aggressive or heavier or stronger has this ability to swing the teeter-totter in such a way that they are the ones that are controlling the movement. And any time that the teeter-totter is down, in a way like this, where you are the one putting a lot of pressure and making the teeter-totter go down, you sort of have the dominant control, okay? So I want you to think about a poker hand like this teeter-totter pendulum. And any time that you are the strong or aggressive or controlling kid, you control the dynamic of that pendulum. And the poker hand works the exact same way. So I want you to mentally imagine the teeter-totter and this concept of range leverage. And here's exactly how it works. The idea is that one player in the hand has the stronger range. It simply is a sort of fancy way that pros use to define which player has the advantage. And so whenever a player has the advantage, they should be the one that is more aggressive. They should be the one that is betting. They should be the one that is leading in the hand. And so the key is first and foremost to understand who has the leverage, who has the advantage. And a clear way to help yourself implement this in real time, to not get lost in emotion or ego, is to imagine that you are observing the hand. You are watching the two players in the hand play. Of course, one of those players is yourself, but imagine that you're watching the hand and the players turn to you, or someone at the table turns to you and says, which player do you think is going to win the pot? Who has the advantage here? If you had to bet money, which player would you bet on? And that answer to that question is the player that has the advantage. And the way to identify this is that the raiser, the person that is raising the pot pre-flop, has the advantage on boards that favor that player. So let me give you an example. If you raise pre-flop and the big blind calls and the flop comes ace, king, deuce, I want you to think about which player has the advantage. And I also want you to think about why. So the idea is that the raiser has a very strong advantage on this board. And the reason is because they have all of the hands that contain aces, kings, and ace-king, whereas the caller does not have those hands. And the reason is because the caller did not 3-bet pre-flop. And everyone pretty much 3-bets pre-flop with aces, kings, and ace-king. So because that player did not 3-bet, they cannot have these extremely strong, we call them nutted or premium hands on this board. Whereas you as the raiser can have these hands because pre-flop you raised and they just called. So this gives you a range advantage. And in other words, if you were on the teeter-totter, you would be rocking it in such a way that you would be the one that is sort of winning the teeter-totter game. You would be the one that's leveraged down and they would be the one that's kind of floating up in the air, and you could throw them off the teeter-totter because they don't have any of those hands and you could have all of them. So this is the first betting framework. It is when to bet. And you want to bet on boards where, on average, you have the stronger range. This is the first framework that I want you to apply. So the mistake that Alan was making, and I see many of my clients make, is they attack boards simply because they are on autopilot. They have a general framework that says something like, I was the pre-flop raiser, they checked to me, and therefore I am going to bet. And that is generally a winning strategy. And the reason is because the pre-flop raiser generally has a stronger hand than the pre-flop caller, but it is not always the case. So I want to give you two examples of when you should be prepared that you're going to face aggression from the caller because the board has a lot of connectivity with their types of hands. The first is on boards that are connected and middling. So a board like 9-8-6 is a very dangerous board for the pre-flop raiser. Sure, they can have hands like pocket nines or pocket eights, but they have fewer hands like 10-7, fewer hands like 7-5, and fewer offsuit hands like 9-8 and 8-6 because they would not raise preflop with those, whereas the big blind will often call preflop with those, especially in a tournament with antes. So the big blind is going to attack this board quite a lot, and you should be prepared for it, and you should either have a plan for what to do when you get called or raised, or consider checking behind to play some pot control. The second example of a board where you should expect to face a lot of aggression are paired boards, in particular when the paired card is more in the caller's range than in your range. So for example, a board like ace-ace-5 is diametrically different than a board like 5-5-6. And the reason is because the preflop raiser has quite a few hands that contain an ace in it, whereas the preflop caller perhaps has less. Whereas a board like 5-5-6 dramatically favors the preflop caller in the sense that they have a lot more hands that contain a 5, namely offsuit 5x hands or hands like queen 5 suited, king 5 suited, that the preflop raiser does not have. So you should expect to get check raised on those boards where the big blind wants to rep the strong nutted trip hands that they have more of than you. So this is very important to understand who has this range leverage. And this is sort of the foundation. Of course, I'm simplifying it dramatically, and hopefully you could actually apply this theory rather than just have some abstract concept of what to do in these spots. And this is the key that I want to impart. It's a theory, it's an idea, it's a concept that you could actually apply to your game. So I want you to think about ranges from this pendulum perspective and let that be your guiding framework for whether or not you should be aggressive because the board and the situation favors you or it favors them. Before we get to the second tip, if you like these strategies, I write a newsletter every Friday called the Poker Playbook, and it's one hand, one lesson, or one edge that is working right now for me in the games I'm playing or my clients that I break down and share with you. It's totally free. It's at consciouspoker.com. Head over there, enter your email, and I'll send it to you this Friday. We also have several free resources for subscribers only, so you could download those as well to help you on your poker journey. The second thing I noticed with Alan that is also very common is sizing incorrectly. And the general idea for sizing is that the more often you are betting, the smaller you're going to bet. And the less often you're betting, the bigger you're going to bet. And the bigger you're betting, you're also telegraphing that you have a lot stronger of a range than your opponent. So going back to the first example that we said, on a board like ace, king, deuce, you could actually bet pretty big on this board because you want to get a lot of money in when you have nutted hands that your opponent doesn't have, because a lot of your range wants to build the pot to stack them when you have them beat. So there's quite a few hands you can choose for a large sizing in this spot. Inversely, you could also go for a smaller size on this board because you are betting this board quite often. So here is a spot where it's a little bit more nuanced and you can use a mixed strategy. Some hands you're going to bet big with, some hands you're going to bet small with, but it's important to understand that you can profitably bet bigger when you have a bigger advantage. And the idea is simple behind this. When you bet small, you are risking a little to win a lot, right? You're risking a small amount relative to the pot. So a common strategy in tournaments is to bet 1/3 of the pot. Well, of course, when you bet 1/3 of the pot, your bet does not have to work that often to be profitable. And so from a risk reward standpoint, you can select more hands to bet 1/3 of the pot with. Now, if you bet the full size of the pot, you are getting a worse price on your wager, and therefore it has to work more often. So you need a stronger range of hands to justify making that same risk reward proposition. So this is a conceptual way to think about it from a pot odds perspective, but it's simplifying it down to the first principles. The less you're risking, the more often you could bet. The more you're risking, the less often you're betting. So the concept here is to think about your frequency. What percent of your range? How often are you betting this board? Is it a spot where you are betting all of the time? We call this a pure bet, meaning you're betting 100% frequency in this spot. You might want to choose a smaller size in because you're betting your entire range on this board. And so you're giving your whole range a great risk reward. You're giving yourself a great price. And that is a fundamental framework for thinking about sizing. I'm going to give you one more tip to think about sizing as well. And it's when you want to apply the maximum amount of pressure on your opponent who has a lot of middle strength hands. So the situation I noticed with Alan, that he was not grasping this nuance that many people miss, is these coordinated boards. There's a big difference between 9-8-6 and something like 5-3 deuce. And I want you to try and think about the reason. This is subtle, but it's actually going to make a material impact in your c-betting strategy. So the idea is 9-8-6, your opponent has a lot of hands that we talked about before that connect with this board, that are nutted hands, very strong hands. On 5-3 deuce, they actually don't have very many, if any, nutted hands. Ace-4 is possible, but a lot of people 3-bet pre-flop with that. 4-6, people don't really play 4-6 offsuit that often, so that's not in there. And there's very few two-pair combos. So on a board like 9-8-6, they could have pretty much all the two pairs, 9-8, 8-6, 9-6, those are all in there. But on 5-3 deuce, most people do not play 5-deuce offsuit. They don't play 5-3 offsuit. There's 3-deuce offsuit. They don't play those hands. So there's very few hands that are actually really strong. There, inversely, are a lot of hands that are very weak. Hands like King 3 suited, King Deuce suited, 5-8 suited, 5-7 suited. There's a lot of hands that are top pair, middle pair, but that are very, very vulnerable. Now you, on the other hand, as the preflop raiser, have Ace-4 suited, certainly, but you also have all of the overpairs that your opponent has very few of. So while your opponent could have a hand like 6s or 7s, they probably don't have 8s, 9s, certainly not 10s through aces, because they did not 3-bet pre. Whereas you can have all of those overpair premium hands. As you may know, there are 6 combinations of every pair, so 10s through aces alone has 30 combos that you can have that your opponent can't have. And so you have this pendulum going very strong in your favor. So you have a range advantage and you have a lot of hands that they do not have. And therefore you can choose a large sizing on this board. You could even go something like pot here in certain circumstances to apply a ton of pressure on your opponents because it puts their entire range on defense, and it makes you very, very hard to play against. One last heuristic I want to leave you with is just think about the players that make your life very difficult and think about what they are doing and apply those same tactics. So if you bet very small on a board like 5-3 deuce, you don't make your opponent's life very difficult. They can just call with a lot of hands, and it's not that hard for them to play. When you pot it, even if they have a hand like King 3 suited, they are suddenly not liking this situation at all. And you set up the hand to potentially apply a lot of pressure on subsequent streets, any turn and any river. And so there's a lot of these spots where you can gain a huge edge by applying these subtle strategies that work really well, that elevate your game to that of the winning players who you want to emulate. I hope these tips helped you, and I'd love you to DM me at Alec Torelli on X or Instagram and let me know your results when you implement them in your next session. If you want a customized game plan like I built for Alan, tailored to your specific games, your playing style, and your goals, apply to work with me at consciouspoker.com. I help busy working professionals make clear decisions, play with confidence, and finally get the results they're looking for. If that's you, head over to Conscious Poker, click on coaching, and apply to learn more. I'll see you in a future video. Thanks for your attention, and good luck out there.